This is an advertisement by BetterHelp. January arrives with a sense of expectation and change. But real change is rarely loud or dramatic.
It's noticing what no longer needs to be there. Thoughts you keep turning over even when they're not helping.
And when you live with those long enough, they can start to feel normal until you pause and see them more clearly. That's where perspective helps. Not fixing yourself, just creating space to understand what's been weighing you down.
Therapy can offer that space, a clearer view of your own patterns and what's worth holding on to. BetterHelp makes starting straightforward. You answer a few questions and they match you with a qualified therapist. If it doesn't feel right, you can switch at any time.
Whether you're into New Year's resolutions or not, working to better yourself is something everyone should do. And you don't even need to bulldoze your life to do it. Simply use BetterHelp.
BetterHelp makes it easy to get matched online with a qualified therapist. Sign up and get 10% off at betterhelp.com/restishistory. That's betterhelp.com/restishistory.
This podcast is brought to you by Carvana. Car shopping shouldn't feel like preparing for a marathon of paperwork. That's why Carvana makes buying and financing your car easy. From start to finish, search thousands of vehicles with great prices. All online, all on your time. And when you're ready, your new car shows up right at your door. It doesn't get better than that. Buy your car the easy way. On Carvana. Delivery fees may apply.
On the 18th of May 1922, the British translator and novelist Sidney Schiff hosted a dinner party at the Majestic Hotel in Paris. 40 guests were invited in all, but there were 4 guests in particular that Schiff wanted to bring together to generate, to see sharing dinner party chat. They were Igor Stravinsky, the great Russian composer, Pablo Picasso, great Cubist painter, James Joyce, Marcel Proust, probably the 2 greatest novelists of the 20th century. Stravinsky and Picasso turn up on time, but Joyce and Proust don't. And then very late, Joyce turns up and he is very shabbily dressed and he's drunk.
Yeah, he's drunk, isn't he?
And he's got drunk because he doesn't have evening wear. And so he's a bit stressed about that. So... Yeah. Which is, I mean, we've all been in that situation where you don't know what you've got to wear.
This is you and your deck shoes again, isn't it?
Exactly. So you just get drunk and then you turn up. And anyway, but then in contrast to Joyce, who's all kind of dishevelled and shabby, Proust turns up at 2:30, immaculately dressed, kind of beautiful buttonhole, white gloves.
You'd expect that.
White silk scarf. And they settle down and their conversation, the conversation between Joyce and Proust, the 2 greatest novelists of the 20th century, well, there are different
it doesn't
versions
sing,
of it. Does it?
There are different versions. So one of them is that Proust, they basically are only thought to have exchanged a few words. And some people say that Proust said to Joyce, "Do you like truffles?" And I'm not going to do Joyce's accent, a terrible Irish accent. Joyce said, I can't do that. Joyce said, "Yes, I do."
That's brilliant. Liam Neeson-esque.
Yeah, that was Liam Neeson-esque.
The reason that we mention this, obviously, is that it's the 100th anniversary, not just of that meeting, but of, Dominic, you suggested this, that this is the year the modern begins. And the person actually who suggested that 1922 was a kind of year zero, well, actually, 1921 is year zero, so 1922 is year one of the new era.
Yeah,
was Ezra Pound, notorious subsequently as a kind of fascist supporter of Mussolini. He went to prison, didn't he? I mean, he got convicted.
He did indeed.
In the long run.
Yes.
But in his early incarnation was an incredible patron of kind of radically brilliant writers. So not just Joyce, but also T.S. Eliot. So, and Eliot's great poem, The Waste Land, is also published in 1922. So Ezra Pound is kind of moving around in the background here. And he wrote to H.L. Mencken, who was the guy who covered the monkey trial in America, Scopes trial. And he said the Christian era ended at midnight on October the 29th to the 30th of last year, i.e. 1921. You are now in the year 1 PSU, post-scriptum Ulysses, if that is any comfort to you. And Dominic, I wonder, do you think Pound was onto something? Is 1922?
Well, we had lots of questions about this, Tom, when we put it out. So Lauren MGM, for example, said why 1922 is it a spectacularly loaded year just due to a cluster of important events. And I think there is something about 1922. So there are particular years, aren't there, that feel, resonant. 1968, 1989, particularly in the sort of immediate aftermath. And I think 1922, to me, it feels like the Great War, and the Great War is completely going to overshadow this episode, as it overshadowed all culture and politics at the time. The Great War had been this tremendous rupture. And then, people think that the sort of war ended and then the Roaring Twenties began. That's the way it's commonly presented in the kind of popular imagination. But it's not really like that at all. The war doesn't end definitively, because lots of fighting continues in 1919, 1920, and so on.
Yeah, as we'll discuss.
The Russian Civil War, fighting in Turkey and so on.
Irish Civil War,
incredibly
war
brutal
in the Levant.
and bloody. So the war doesn't really end. And there's this period of 2 or 3 years of tremendous flux and uncertainty. And I think 1922 feels like the point at which things begin to settle down a bit and a new order is sort of palpable, and new themes that are going to dominate the politics. Actually, in the case of one of these themes, which is Bolshevism and the existence of the USSR, the USSR only comes into being at the end of 1922, but that's not just going to dominate the politics of the 1920s, it's going to dominate politics right through to the end of the 1980s. And I think you can argue there is a block of history from the early 1920s right through to, let's say, the end of the 1980s that is dominated. The issue of communism and versus capitalism is absolutely central to it, but also the disintegration of the great empires and what is going to happen to the world in the wake of these European colonial empires.
Yes, you could also say about other things as well, that relationship of United Kingdom and Ireland.
Yes.
Dated 1922, really. The configuration of what we'd call the Middle East, but then would have been known as the Levant. Takes on, things develop in 1922. But I wonder if we're talking specifically about, 1922 as the year that the modern begins.
Yeah.
There are obviously that the events that we're talking about now are political ones. And you could say 1914 would be a more obvious one, or 1917 for the Russian Revolution, or 1918, the end of the First World War. But we began with Picasso and Stravinsky and Joyce and Proust. And there is also this idea that around this time, culturally, things change. And that 1922 could rank there with, Freud or Picasso or whatever. But I think the reason for this year, particularly if you're English speaking, is that the greatest English novel in English and the greatest poem in English written in the 20th century, both published in the same year.
Yeah,
and they're both texts that cast themselves as kind of modern.
Yeah, I think
and
that's
indeed in a way
right.
kind of, a breaking down of the tradition that had gone before.
I think that's absolutely right. It's the end of Victorianism, isn't it? We can argue the modern and modernism are very, very slippery concepts.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thomas Hardy talks about the ache of modernism in Tessa the d'Urbervilles, written decades before. And you can see modernist fiction, modernist culture emerging before the First World War. You could see it in Henry James or in Joseph Conrad or something. But you're absolutely right. For anybody who's ever done English literature at university or something, 1922 is this absolute landmark year, because you have, in February, you have the publication of Ulysses, which is James Joyce's novel.
It's on the second day of the second month of 1922. So it's 2222, which is Joyce's 40th birthday.
Perfect. And then at the end of the year, or towards the end of the year, October, the publication of T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land. So we've got these two great landmarks. And let's talk about Joyce first, because the interesting thing about Ulysses is that Ulysses is not really a 20s novel, because he conceived it so long before. He conceived it well before the First World War, 1906, 1907 or something? And it's set. When is it set, Tom? You know when it's set, do you?
Well, it's set on the 16th of June, 1904, which is the day that Joyce first had a kind of date with the woman that he would subsequently go on to marry, who was a chambermaid from Galway called splendidly Nora Barnacle.
Yes.
And so the whole novel is an attempt to bring to life fictionally the Dublin that Joyce was living in on that day.
Yeah.
And it's a stupefying achievement. But as you say, it's actually not a novel that is really about the First World War or the convulsions of the age at all. And in fact, Joyce spent the First World War in neutral Switzerland.
He did,
and
Zurich,
kind of affected is there a war on kind of tone. I mean, and this 1922 is the year of establishment of the Irish Free State, collapse into civil war. Joyce affects a complete lack of interest in it. And in fact, he keeps the British passport till he dies.
Yeah, he never had an Irish passport.
I mean, it's not like he's very, very hostile to British imperialism in Ulysses.
The Brutish Empire, yeah. And Ulysses, the funny thing about Ulysses is at the point that it's published, it's describing a world that no longer exists. Because at that point, Ireland and Britain have been embroiled in the Irish War of Independence, and within weeks, as you say, Ireland is going to be engulfed by civil war. So he's describing a Dublin that in some ways you could argue has kind of vanished.
Well, absolutely vanished. I mean, because it's this weird combination of incredible imagination, incredible kind of verbal pyrotechnics. You can never quite be sure where he's going to go with his imagination, with his literary styling, with all kinds of radically novel fictional techniques. But at the same time, he is deliberately trying to evoke a specific day. And so he studies all the newspapers and, he writes to people saying, what were you doing on such and such a day? And what was going on? What shops were there? And all this kind of stuff. And I think that's the fascination of it, is that it's a novel that, in a way, very self-consciously tries to fragment the literary traditions of the novel, but also is very, very aware of itself within that tradition.
Well, that's what makes it very modernist, though, isn't it?
Exactly. So rather like Picasso in his Cubist phase, the process of kind of deconstruction depends on there being a great tradition to deconstruct.
Yeah. I mean, that's exactly... So when T.S. Eliot writes The Waste Land, which we'll come to in a second, and he's sort of assembling it from fragments of poems and of novels and of kind of Shakespearean references and so on, it's exactly the same thing. It's the sort of image of somebody smashing... taking culture and smashing it into fragments, then trying to reassemble them to make a kind of new myth, because there's a lot of myth in both of those. I mean,
one way perhaps in which Joyce, like Eliot, is responding to a sense of the modern. So Eliot, in an essay he writes on the metaphysical poets, so that's John Donne and people like that, he famously says that we can only say that it appears likely that poets in our civilization, as it exists at present, must be difficult. Our civilization comprehends great variety and complexity, and this variety and complexity, playing upon a refined sensibility, must produce various and complex results. Now, that's also what Joyce is basically doing.
Yeah.
That even to try and sum up a single day in a single city in the modern world is so difficult. The conventional forms of fiction are inadequate to it. And so you need to kind of... that's why it has to be difficult. Now, Dominic, this, of course... your great theme in your wonderful series of books on modern Britain is that, of course, while, the radical artistic talents are doing their stuff, life goes on as normal.
Yeah.
And of course, that is the backdrop, both to Ulysses and The Waste Land. So do you know who else actually had her first work published in 1922?
Go on, Tom. Amaze me.
Enid Blyton.
Wow.
So Enid Blyton, her first volume it was a volume of poetry, her very first line of verse. So this is a fascinating compliment to Eliot in The Waste Land. In the garden very early, Rosamunda's walking, and to her surprise she hears lots of fairies talking.
Oh, isn't that nice?
Which in a way, so in The Waste Land,
yeah,
people walk along banks of rivers or cross London Bridge, and you hear strange phantasmal voices from
very
different
similar
eras of time. Well, there's but Enid Blyton said about modernism, and I'm sure she had Joyce in mind particularly, I'm young and normal, and I prefer something more wholesome.
That's fantastic. Well, I mean, you see, this is one of the interesting things. So this is arguably, so the people you mentioned, Picasso, Stravinsky, Joyce, Eliot, what they all have in common is not just that they're trying to assemble new myths, new ways of seeing the world out of the fragments of the past, out of a world that's been shattered in the first decades of the 20th
these fragments
century.
have I shored against my ruin.
Exactly. Yeah. But they are all, in a way that is, I think, different from the previous couple of generations. They're very controversial. And they delight in being radical and avant-garde and getting terrible reviews. So, people have famously kind of walked out of The Rite of Spring and been horrified by it when Stravinsky pioneered it in 1930. And Ulysses in 1922. I mean, 1922 is punctuated by Ulysses getting a series of absolutely terrible and hilarious reviews. So the Daily Herald said nearly 6 years of Joyce's life to write, and it will take nearly 6 years of ours to read. The Daily Express, always very robust. Our first impression is that of sheer disgust. Our second of irritability. Our third of boredom. Reading Mr. Joyce is like making an excursion to Bolshevist Russia. Well, this is a theme we'll come back to. And my favourite one is from the Sporting Times. Can you believe the Sporting Times? The Pink 'Un, as it was called, reviewed Joyce. And it said, it appears to have been written by a perverted lunatic who has made a speciality of the literature of the latrine.
Yeah.
So I mean, this is
but of course. So if you are giving the whole of life, Ulysses follows three people. One of them, Stephen Dedalus, who's basically Joyce. It's a self-portrait of the artist as a young man. Then Leopold Bloom, who is a cuckolded Jewish salesman, and then right at the end, this great kind of single sentence soliloquy monologue from Bloom's wife Molly. But obviously, if you're following these figures through their whole course of the day, they have to do all kinds of things. So
going to the toilet.
So go to the toilet, but also masturbation, sexual fantasy. And Joyce was actually, a tremendous prude. He didn't like vulgarity. He wrote the occasional erotic letter to Nora Barnacle. But they're so few that when they come up for sale in auctions, they kind of go for 300 grand or whatever.
Yeah.
But what reviews go on and on and on about is how obscene it is and how vulgar it is and how common it is. And the person who...
Well, I know where you're going with this.
Who famously was appalled by it was Virginia Woolf.
The John Lennon of the early 20th century, in my view.
Who in the long run would, of course, be, with Mrs. Dalloway and everything, would be hugely influenced by Ulysses. But the scratching of pimples on the body of the boot boy at Claridge's.
Well, I know some of our listeners have a tendresse for Virginia Woolf, and I will merely say, this is how she describes Ulysses: an illiterate, underbred book. The book of a self-taught working man, and we all know how distressing they are, how egotistic, insistent, raw, striking, and ultimately nauseating. So that's Virginia Woolf on our listeners, because I like to think our listeners are very much the salt of the earth. And that's why we have a series of Penguin Classics kind of branded cups at home, and I refuse to drink out of the Virginia Woolf mug because I won't give Mrs. Woolf the satisfaction of drinking from her branded mug.
But Virginia Woolf was keener on The Waste Land.
Yeah, so The Waste Land comes out at the end of the year.
Of T.S. Eliot.
Yeah, she was. And The Waste Land, I think, because it's a poem, it doesn't get the same scrutiny from the popular press as a novel would. And The Waste Land obviously isn't effectively, Ulysses doesn't come out. You can't read Ulysses in Britain until the 1930s unless you go to France or somewhere to get a copy.
And that, of course, adds to its notoriety.
Yeah.
So it's a book that lots and lots of people have both heard of and not read.
Yeah.
And the vast numbers of people who haven't read it is kind of part of its fame.
Yeah. Whereas The Waste Land, I think it's just a poem that most people just haven't read because most people probably don't read much poetry. There's this fantastic story about T.S. Eliot going to Buckingham Palace to read it. Have you heard this?
Is this the one with the Queen Mother giggles?
Yes.
Get the giggles.
He goes to read it to George VI, the Queen Mother.
Very serious, isn't he?
Princess Elizabeth and the current Queen and Princess Margaret. And he starts reading. And the Queen Mother says the girls start laughing, and then she starts laughing, and then the King starts laughing. And T.S. Eliot is there, shanty, 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 or whatever. And they're just laughing at him.
But I guess the reason for that is that The Waste Land is again, like Ulysses, it's a difficult poem. and Eliot has said poets in our civilization as it exists at present must be difficult. And what he's essentially doing is that he's saying that after the war, maybe before that, civilization has been smashed into so many pieces that you can only have fragments. And so you read it, and it is a kind of bewildering compendium of voices. And a bit like a Picasso painting, there may be a hint of a guitar or a bull in a geometric shape. You get kind of hit. So, April's Cruelest Month is famously the opening, and then suddenly you get the voice of this girl. And when we were children, staying at the Archduke's, my cousins, he took me out on a sled, and I was frightened. The Archduke. I mean, it's not saying who the Archduke is, but there's the echo of the incident that began the war, and the whole poem kind of operates like that. You get very, very highbrow voices. You get voices in foreign languages. You get demotic voices, and it's disorienting, and I think brilliant in its impact. And again, Pound has a crucial influence on this because Eliot sends him the first draft of it and he revises it. And he has what is my all-time favourite response of a friend reading another friend's work. Complimenty, you bitch. I am racked by the 7 jealousies. And I think if writers are being honest, we've all slightly.
That's right, because when a friend of yours sends you something to read, you basically want it to be. You don't want it to be terrible, but you want it to be just slightly better than mediocre, don't you? And when it's brilliant, you just think, "Oh no, disastrous."
Well, there's perhaps a slight element of that.
But standing back from particularly from the Wasteland, I mean, we're going to come on to the politics of the 20s in a second. But to me, it feels so indelibly marked by the Great War. I mean, there's that moment when there are the crowds of the dead coming across is it London Bridge?
Unreal city under the brown fog of a winter dawn. A crowd flowed over London Bridge. So many I had not thought death had undone so many.
And that's sort of, I mean, everybody in 1922 is living in a world where, there are families on every street who are mourning people lost in the war, where so many of the old certainties have been destroyed. Empires, countries, assumptions, political parties, institutions, and so on. But also, of course, Spanish flu. I mean, that's one thing that really looms large now, looking from our sort of COVID-stricken viewpoint.
Well, that phrase, the brown fog of a winter dawn. I remember actually walking across London Bridge in the depths of the lockdown and remembering that. It was last January, remembering that phrase, the brown fog of a winter dawn, as emblematic of disease. Yeah.
And the sort of, when we come onto the politics, so much of the language that people use, they talk about viruses and germs and the bacillus of Bolshevism and stuff. And that stuff there's a kind of morbidity. There's a historian called Richard Overy who's written a brilliant book about Britain, about British culture in the 1920s and 30s called The Morbid Age. And he talks again and again in this book about how there's this sense of civilization having cracked and then inevitable doom and decadence and degeneracy awaiting.
And that is the essentially the theme of The Wasteland, and it doesn't really offer redemption.
Well, at the end, there's doesn't the water fall on the dried earth? Kind of, but in the long run, Eliot will find redemption in becoming very conservative. So he gets baptized into the Church of England. He becomes a kind of royalist and a traditionalist, and he does kind of stitch back together the great kind of inheritance of tradition that he smashed in The Wasteland. And so maybe that was recognised by the woman who provided the money to publish, the Criterion, which is the magazine in which The Wasteland was published. Yes. So people always get the publications wrong with modernism because they think it's all about little magazines and the Criterion and so on. But actually, of course, as you know, Tom, the money for the Criterion is put up by by Lady Rothermere, the wife of Lord Rothermere, proprietor of the Daily Mail. And of course, the Daily Mail also played a very important part in the genesis of modernism because Joseph Conrad had been a great Daily Mail man
and indeed at one point signed a contract to be a columnist for the Daily Mail. Did you know this?
Well, great writers. The Daily Mail employs nothing but the best.
Well, you know what? Joseph Conrad, he couldn't get on with this, actually. He wasn't good at writing to deadline.
Did he find but his integrity wouldn't allow him?
No, he did not. He desperately wanted to do it. I think in some ways Joseph Conrad was probably too conservative for the Daily Mail. He couldn't do it on time. So do you know who he got to ghostwrite his articles for him?
No, I don't.
The poet Edward Thomas.
Brilliant.
Edward
Only
Thomas
Connect.
wrote for
Only
the Daily
Connect.
Mail as Joseph Conrad. How about
But you
that?
know Pound's take on the Rothermeres?
No, I don't. Oh no, Tom.
A family, Pound wrote damningly to Eliot. The Rothermeres are a family which is not interested in good literature.
Well, Eliot did not agree, because not only did Eliot publish The Waste Land and the Criterion, but in Kevin Jackson's book about 1922, which I know you've read,
yes,
Constellation of
Genius,
he has a footnote, I think it is, where he's talking about a trial where a couple they've been hanged for the murder of the woman's husband. And the woman, so basically this woman was having an affair, and she said to her lover, God, I wish my husband was dead. So her lover killed her husband.
He jumped out of a bush, didn't he?
He did. So the lover was understandably found guilty and hanged, but so was she. Even though she hadn't really she hadn't really been an accessory to it or anything.
And the murderer said that she wasn't.
Yeah. So basically she was hanged very harshly. Very harshly. There's a tremendous outcry about it. And the Daily Mail took a very, robust...
Stephen Lawrence.
No, it took a very robust...
Oh, did it? Okay. Well, so did Eliot. Eliot thought...
And Eliot wrote to the paper and said, thank God you've taken such a strong view. I'm glad you haven't gone in for that. What did he call it? Flaccid sentimentality. Yeah. Something about hanging. Yeah. So Eliot wanted more women to be hanged.
No,
so
Eliot was very robust.
Well, robust is probably not.
Well, he was, and a bit like Virginia Woolf, he was a bit of a snob.
He was a bit, actually, yes.
He also was obsessed with spotty men.
Yeah.
So, like Virginia Woolf going on about the spotty...
Is it the young man carbuncular?
The young man carbuncular, one of the low on whom assurance sits as a silk hat on a Bradford millionaire.
Right. We should probably take a break, Tom, because we've got quite bogged down in...
I think we got bogged down. I think we were taking wing.
You think so?
Yeah.
I think in writers writing to the Daily Mail, I think that's surely the definition of getting a bit bogged down. But I think after the break, what we'll do is we will step back a bit and widen our focus, and we'll talk about the context for all this, which is the splintering of all those old certainties, the collapse of empires, and the international outlook. So we shall see you after the break.
This episode is brought to you by Rocket Money.
Tom, we often talk about how to organise our finances. I'm very conscious that I'm paying for a lot of mad subscriptions. And there's one thing that we've talked about often on this show. It's the thing that we probably hate more than any other, and it's a hidden fee. I would love to get my finances under control. There are all these things piling up on our bank statements, and I think I need to fix this problem. I need to sort this out and to stop this.
I mean, my finances are so chaotic that I need this app.
So I'll tell you what it is. It's called Rocket Money. It's a personal finance app that helps find and cancel your unwanted subscriptions. It monitors your spending, and it helps to lower your bills so that you can grow your savings.
With Rocket Money, you can track all of your subscriptions, and you can easily cancel within the app with just a few taps, saving you time, avoiding charges. And you can also set budgets and goals and get personalized insights and regular reports to track how you're doing. They will even send you real-time alerts for large transactions, upcoming bills, refunds, and even low balances. So let Rocket Money help you reach your financial goals faster. Join at rocketmoney.com/ishistory.
That's rocketmoney.com/ishistory. rocketmoney.com/ishistory.
Hello, welcome back to The Rest is History. We are talking 1922. It was 100 years ago this year. And Dominic, you were very keen on doing this because you're seriously arguing that this is a year where, in a sense, kind of the modern begins. But of course, 1922 exists in the context of the monumental civilizational smash up that was the Great War. So, how is the world kind of healing in the wake of the war? Or
Well, I
is
don't
it
think healing is really the word, actually. There's a general sense of rubble, I think. And I think maybe in this sort of second half...
A wasteland, even.
We're going, yeah, it's very much a wasteland. So we're going to do two episodes on this, really, aren't we? And I think in this second half, we should concentrate on 3 countries in particular. So one of them, the most obvious one that has been sort of maimed, dismembered...
Pauperized.
Is Germany. So Germany has lost its empire. It's been reduced. Actually, 1922 specifically is not... I mean, it's not as bad as some years for Germany. So Germany has gone through a revolution. There has been kind of fighting between the Spartakists and the Freikorps. But by and large, the Weimar Republic has kind of got things back under control. There are sort of straws in the wind, though. So Hitler has joined the Nazi Party.
He's making mischief in Munich.
He's sort of giving rabble-rousing beer hall speeches to kind of...
So this is the point where he's discovered his gift for oratory.
He has, exactly. So having infiltrated the Nazi Party initially as a kind of army sort of informer, exactly. He has become the great orator of the Nazi Party and has become its leader. But he hasn't quite got the sort of national following that he'll get later, because he hasn't done his kind of beer hall putsch yet. So he's still a sort of demagogic rabble-rouser rather than a sort of national player. But you do have a sense, I think, in Germany. So there's a guy called Walter Rathenau, who is the foreign minister, who negotiates a deal.
The one who gets assassinated?
He gets assassinated exactly by right-wing paramilitaries. So there's a real sense of the instability at the core of the Weimar Republic. You also have in Germany the sort of the cultural expression of the kind of the morbidity and the dissolution. So you have things like the film Nosferatu.
Yeah.
And which is a version of
reworking of Dracula, isn't it?
Exactly, of Dracula, vampire story. And that sort of obsession, there's a kind of vampiric obsession in German expressionist kind of cinematic culture in the 20s.
George Gross's cartoons.
Yeah.
Horrible.
Incredibly horrible, scatological scathing. Yeah. All of that stuff.
Yeah.
Or Fritz Lang does his first Dr. Mabuse films in 1922. Again, sort of brooding, dark, sort of vampiric stuff.
So famously, in the long run, the Nazis will come to power by saying that Germany hadn't actually lost the First World War, they were stabbed in the back.
Yeah.
Is there, in 1922, do Germans feel that they are a defeated people? Or do they feel that they've been betrayed and that they could have carried on?
I think it depends on the German, actually.
Yeah, okay.
I think some, let's say the people that Rathenau kind of represent, so that would be the kind of, you have a part of Germany that is invested in the Weimar Republic, and they would be kind of liberal-minded, middle-class, sort of democratically minded people. But you have an enormous number of people in the kind of conservative wing of the spectrum who, they don't really ever accept the legitimacy of the Weimar Republic. They do think that Germany was betrayed in some way. I mean, this is the argument that Erich Ludendorff, the former sort of co-dictator of Germany at the end of the First World War, is pushing by this point in the early 20s. He's saying, well, we could have fought on, but the politicians wouldn't let us, and we were betrayed by fifth columnists and all this sort of thing. And obviously the chief scapegoats are the Jews.
Yeah.
And you definitely see this already. And there's a sort of paramilitary quality of German politics already.
Yeah.
And part of that...
So the communists fighting the right, the hard right, in Berlin and Munich and so on.
Yeah.
Presumably what the effect of that is that it is... it's kind of delegitimizing every kind of authority, every kind of break on the resort to violence.
Yeah, I think violence, a kind of paramilitary violence, is built into is implicit in the sort of post-war Germany from the very beginning, because its early months are scarred by so much fighting. Kind of attempt to set up a Soviet in Munich and so on, kind of Bavarian Socialist Republic. Endless sort of putches and coups and so on, and this sort of sense of that the Republic never really commands widespread acceptance across German society, And I think that means that although it later on in the 20s, that has this brief period where it seems like it's becoming a bit more stable. So that's after the great inflation of 1922 to 33 has abated.
Yeah. So the inflation.
Yeah, and the inflation is absolutely crazy.
That's the key. I mean, that's the real killer.
Yeah, so the inflation, I think at the beginning of 22, a mark is worth, you can get something like 350 marks to the dollar. And by the end of 1922, it's something like, it sounds unbelievable, 7,400 marks to the dollar. So that's a colossal change, a colossal sort of debauching of your currency. And then by late 1923, it's billions of marks to the dollar. So, I mean, that's your classic image of the wheelbarrows full of banknotes. And obviously that destroys people's savings. It erodes middle-class people's faith in the system.
And it pauperizes the middle classes.
Yeah, completely. Absolutely.
And
absolutely
a pauperized middle class is always the wellspring of a revolutionary activity.
And don't forget that all this is happening, Tom, against the backdrop of what we're going to talk about in a few minutes, which is Bolshevism, which is the arrival of the Russian Revolution. I think.
Okay, but Dominic, just on the topic, so we're looking at 1922 as the year that modernity begins. One of the enduring effects of the Great Inflation in Germany is a German horror at inflation.
Yeah,
which has been a massive, massive factor in the evolution of the European Union.
Yes, that's true.
So in that sense, the economics of Germany in 1922 continue to reverberate right the way up into the present day.
Yeah, I think they do, because of course the German response to the Eurozone crisis was partly informed by the fact that generations of German politicians have always sort of said never again. Inflation is the great enemy, which is ironic because actually the thing that really brought the Nazis to power was not inflation, was not the inflation. It was the unemployment caused by the onset of the Great Depression after 1931.
Yeah.
But, it's the inflation, oddly, that has become the defining image of Weimar Germany, of its failure to.
Well, I suppose Germany
order.
was so rich and prosperous and successful before the war that the impoverished bourgeois carrying mark notes on wheelbarrows.
Yeah.
I mean, it's.
Well, I think actually what you get is, I don't know if you've read that book so Colm Tóibín had a book last year about Thomas Mann, and a novel about the life of Thomas Mann. So Thomas Mann wrote the great book about kind of bourgeois German Victorianism, Buddenbrooks, about this family in Lübeck. And when you read the Colm Tóibín book about Mann's life, just that journey that nobody really in the English-speaking world can possibly contemplate, that you go from pre-war Germany, the most dynamic, the most sort of self-satisfied, prosperous country in Europe.
And in many ways, the most progressive.
Yeah, and very progressive, to this basket case in the 1920s, and then the horrors of the 30s and 40s and so on. I mean, it's just the most extraordinary trajectory. And
so if we're talking about the horrors of the 1930s and 40s, and indeed the horrors of the 20th century generally, the fact that... So 1922 is a key year in it's the establishment of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
It's effectively the establishment of Stalin's primacy, because although Lenin is still alive, he's had the stroke, and Stalin has made himself General Secretary of the Communist Party, and he uses this as a way to essentially muscle out the opposition and bring Lenin under his thumb. So communism, obviously, is a massive theme for the decades that are to come. But also in 1922, and we did an episode on the Rubicon a little bit earlier this week, but you have Mussolini's March on Rome, and so the rise of fascism.
Absolutely. And I think those two things are completely intertwined. So what happens in Italy, well, maybe we'll come on to Russia in just a second. So Italy had entered the First World War very foolishly, in my view, to try and get more territory. It had basically changed sides, done a dirty deal to come in on the Allied side because they wanted to snatch bits of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Italian army had performed incredibly poorly. Its soldiers very heroically, but the generals utterly inept. They'd lost 700,000 men. They'd run up colossal debts. They'd gained virtually nothing. And at the end of the war, they're fobbed, as they see it, they're fobbed off by the other allies. They're not given the great empire they want in the Adriatic. They're given a bit of territory, but nothing like what they think they're going to get. And there's this tremendous sense in Italy that they have been utterly shortchanged, that they've had this horrendous experience. I mean, the Italian front.
They're kind of blowing off the tops of mountains, aren't they?
It's awful. It's absolutely awful. Yeah. They fight. There's the Battle of the Isonzo. There were 12 battles of the Isonzo, I think. Yeah. They're just constantly charging at the Austrians and just being machine gunned.
So I went to Lake Como, which I'd never been to, and climbed up a mountain. And there was this tunnel that kind of went through a mountain that had been hacked out with hand picks. And you just thought, absolute waste of effort that went into all that.
The Italian front is so horrible that there are all these stories of Italians charging up the karst, which is this sort of exposed limestone mountainous region in the sort of Italian-Slovenian border. There are all these stories of Italians charging up these hillsides and the Austrians at the top of the hill shouting at them to go back, basically saying, if you turn back and run away, we won't shoot at you because, we're going to kill you. And the Italians just keep coming and the Austrians just mow them down. And the Austrian army is completely inept itself. So the fact that it's able to hold off the Italians tells you how badly the Italian generals are performing. Anyway, this is a bit of a segue, a bit of a sidetrack rather. Italy is in a terrible state at the end of the First World War. It's absolutely in the early 20s. It is riven by labour unrest. There are whole waves of factory occupations. There's tremendous unemployment. There's great hostility, sort of class hostility and so on. And what you have by 1922 is that this guy who has been a socialist journalist, Mussolini, completely shamelessly basically changes his colours and offers his support and basically all the radical energy that he had previously put into the left-wing sort of cause. He basically gets into bed with the landowners, the factory owners and the right, and says, my squadristi, my squads, my kind of paramilitary units are at your disposal to fight off Bolshevism. And there's a series of punch-ups and there's a real sense of kind of seething violence. And then there's a general strike in the late summer that fails. And against that backdrop, Mussolini launches his famous March on Rome.
Which isn't really a march, is it?
No, it's an absolute con. It's a complete con. He gets up in Naples and sort of gives this tremendous speech saying, we should all march on Rome and seize power.
Our programme is simple. We want to rule Italy.
Yeah. But then he doesn't go himself. He's such a coward. He doesn't go. He goes off to Milan instead. Well, they all, he says, you can lead the march. I'll just weigh in.
And then the king appoints him prime minister.
So the king, it's a really interesting parallel with what happens in Germany in the end of 32, early 33. The Italian prime minister is a guy called Luigi Facta, and he basically says, these fascists are a rabble. There's 20,000 of them. They're pouring with rain. They're very bedraggled. We don't have anything to fear from them. I've got more troops. I'll declare a state of emergency, crush them, and it'll be fine. And the king panics and refuses to sign the order, Victor Emmanuel III. And he says he thinks, no, maybe the thing to do is, because he's obviously quite conservative himself, he thinks maybe the thing to do is bring Mussolini on side. Let's not have any trouble. And he appoints Mussolini as prime minister.
And Mussolini turns up for the ceremony in his black shirt and a top hat.
Yeah. Well, Dan Jackson has been on our podcast to talk about the birth of the railways in a top hat, but he wasn't wearing a black shirt.
No, he wasn't. Well, he also wasn't about to become Prime Minister of Italy, to be fair to Dan.
No, he wasn't. So obviously the rise of fascism in Italy, I mean, if you're looking at 1922, that's an absolutely massive moment, because then people start in Germany saying, where is our Mussolini?
Well, but Dominic, you said, so Mussolini goes from being a socialist to being a fascist.
Yeah.
And that this was a total reversal. But in a way, I mean, he's not becoming a kind of supporter of liberal economics or capitalism.
No,
Adam Smith or something. No. I mean, essentially, the energies of the fascists and the communists, they're so electrifying because they're so similar. Isn't that right?
Yeah, you're right. I mean we could get into a huge conversation here, couldn't we, about the sort of the protean and the sort of the ambiguity,
because they're national socialists.
The ambiguity of fascism in the early 20s. That it appears both radical and conservative. Of course, it appears both modern and anti-modern. So fascist parties classically use radio, cars, planes. They glory in their modernity at the same time as they're harking back to
ancient
an
Rome and
idealized,
stuff.
to idealized past.
And the guy who blazes the trail for that for Mussolini is D'Annunzio.
Terrible man. Absolutely.
Who
Basically, the man who got Italy into the First World War in the first place.
Yeah. And he establishes a kind of proto-fascist state in Trieste, which is where Joyce had been, where he wrote.
And of course, D'Annunzio is another poet.
Another poet.
Yeah, like Enid Blyton.
Yeah. Okay. Well, anyway, so that's enough about fascists. What about communists?
Yeah, I don't know what you think, Tom. I think the two keys to this whole period are the Great War and communism, because it's fear of communism that drives a lot of the sort of right-wing stuff. Not that the right-wing stuff doesn't have roots of its own, but I think that paralyzing fear of Bolshevism. I mean, paralyzing is the wrong word, actually. It's an energizing fear of communism. So Russia, it's had its revolutions. It's been through this period, sort of from 1918 to 1920 of civil war, of this incredibly weird civil war with lots of different people, and the Czechs are involved and the Allies are sending troops. Most of the civil war is done and dusted by 1920, but they're still mopping up in Central Asia in 1922. And in fact, extraordinarily, the last Allied forces, so the last Japanese forces, don't leave Siberia until 1922. They're in Vladivostok, and they leave in the summer. And then the Red Army marches into Vladivostok on the 25th of October. But what's also going on, which I hadn't really appreciated until reading up on this, was that there's a lot of attention given to the sort of famine caused by Stalin's collectivization measures later on. But there's a tremendously horrendous famine in Russia itself in 1922. So about 5 million people probably die.
God, that's incredible.
Starvation.
You don't even
on the Volga,
and that barely even registers
in places like Kazan and Samara. Yeah, exactly. That now so much has happened that 5 million people that's kind of lost.
While the Spanish flu is also.
Yeah, of course. The Spanish flu is kind of becoming, well, but
you've had the First World War, millions die.
Yeah.
Spanish flu, millions die. This famine, which I'd never even heard of. I heard
millions.
The one in Ukraine, but I hadn't
and
heard
something like 10 million people have died in the Russian Civil War. I mean, colossal. Just unbelievable figures.
I mean, and it's like Hitler says, when you start talking about millions, the
people
brain
tune
fades.
Out. Yeah,
you tune out.
I think that's absolutely what happens. So there's been the
loss of one life is a tragedy.
Well, yeah, and a million is a statistic, exactly. But the Soviet Union it's not yet the Soviet Union. Russia is in a very uncertain place because they've had what they called war communism, where they basically seized estates and they tried to suppress all capitalism. Then in 1921, Lenin had slightly changed course, and he had said, well, we'll allow some small enterprise to happen, and peasants can sell their surpluses. And this is what is called his new economic policy, NEP. But then, as you say, Lenin has this stroke in May 1922. It's a great what if, actually, Tom. I mean, it's the great what ifs that Trotskyists and Stalinists have argued about for decades. What would have happened if what did Lenin really want for Russia? Lenin has this stroke, and as you said, Stalin, he really begins his rise. He controls Lenin, he controls access to Lenin, he's general secretary of the party. So he's sharing power with two other guys, particularly Kamenev and Zinoviev. But there is this sort of sense that Stalin is, because he has the party machine, he is the coming man. And it's Stalin who is probably the key player in the creation of the USSR.
Okay, which is announced in December, is it?
Yeah, December, exactly. They have the big meetings to decide it, sort of 28th to the 30th of December. And it's not quite what Lenin wanted. So Lenin had wanted a union of Soviet republics of Europe and Asia. And Stalin changed the title to the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, I think partly because Lenin seems to have wanted a slightly more kind of federal system. He hated the idea of great Russian chauvinism.
Liberal.
And Stalin, sort of paradoxically, despite the fact he was Georgian, was not so keen on that. He didn't want to encourage nationalism. So they take out the Europe and Asia stuff, and it's just the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And it ends up, it basically covers the old Tsarist empire.
But isn't it also that Lenin was, in the best Marxist sense, wanted universal revolution? and it's Stalin in the long run who will go for
Socialism in one country.
In one country.
Yeah, exactly right.
So you're starting to see the process by which what the Soviet Union, as it becomes in December, will essentially become a communist equivalent of the Tsarist Empire.
Yeah, I think that's right, actually, Tom. Because although for the time being, Stalin is allied to Zinoviev, who wants to kind of export. He's the head of the Comintern, so he's basically,
and Trotsky as well, of course,
in charge, of course, of Trotsky.
Very keen on all that.
But you're right that he's going to start moving that way. But of course, nobody else knows this, and I think we've probably gone on long enough on this episode. But this is the point in which we should end this. Nobody else knows that that's where Bolshevism is going to go. Yeah. So they all think it's going to be exported. And we mentioned the Comintern. That's why you have partly one reason why you have the paramilitary politics in Germany. It's why you have fascism in Italy and so on, because it's against this I said paralyzing again, and it's completely wrong. This sort of enervating, energizing fear. And you see that in, what I love about the early 20s that I think is so often missed by kind of the sort of roaring 20s cocktail glasses and F. Scott Fitzgerald view of it is the mad kind of paranoia. And you see that in so much popular culture. So I used to read these books when I was at school, which were utterly, utterly inappropriate. I think by today's standards, which were the Bulldog Drummond books. We talked about Bulldog Drummond.
Yes, in James Bond.
In James Bond, he's an ancestor. And in 1922, Sapper, who is his real name is H.C. McNeil. And yet to pick up a theme of this podcast, Tom, he is encouraged into writing for the Daily Mail. He had been in the Royal Engineers.
The Daily Mail has basically created modernity then.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So he writes these books about this guy called Captain Hugh Drummond, and he's a demobbed soldier. And like so many of the people who joined, Mussolini's black shirts or the Freikorps in Germany, he's come back from the war, Drummond, and he's bored. He doesn't know what to do, and he wants to fight people. And in this book, published second book in 1922, he sets up a group called the Black Gang, and they dress up in black coats, very Ku Klux Klan, and they go around beating up communists who are infiltrating.
Is this written in the consciousness of what Mussolini's doing?
No, I think
so separate.
I suppose he probably must know to some, but I don't think it's. I definitely don't think it's deliberately inspired.
Right.
But people sort of say, there's a point. I won't read out because I've been sending you quotes for the last few days, many of which are utterly unrepeatable. But there's a point in which two people are talking about what's going on. One of them says to the other, that there is an organized and well-financed conspiracy to preach Bolshevism in England we have known for some time. How well organized it is we did not realize. But as you'll see, there is not a single manufacturing town or city in Great Britain that has not got a branch of that organization installed. He says, you can see in front of you the proofs of their appalling spread of these proletarian Sunday schools with their abominable propaganda and their avowed attempt to convert the children who attend them to a creed whose beginning is destruction and whose end is chaotic anarchy.
But Dominic, aren't I right then? That communism is just Christianity Monkey.
Well, it's proletarian Sunday schools. But picking up that stuff we were saying about the Spanish flu and viruses and the language in the Waste Land, the same character then goes on to say, we're a free country, Sir John, but the time is coming when freedom as we understand it in the past will have to cease. That's very fascistic. We can't go on as the cesspit of Europe, sheltering microbes who infect us as soon as they are here. Goodness. We want disinfecting. We want it badly. And this isn't Italy or Germany. No. This is Britain, and these are a series of books that are immensely popular with and are made into films throughout the 1920s. They're immensely popular, kind of middle class, law-abiding, self-consciously respectable kind of people.
And 1922 is, I think, the year when the British Empire is, geographically speaking, at its largest extent.
Yeah,
Britain is the victor in the First World War, so you
that's
might
the
think
victor.
that it was, at its absolute peak. But as we shall find out in part 2, it is in many ways a colossus with feet of clay, as Bart van Loo would put it.
Very good.
So, Dominic, we'll do another episode, put that out tomorrow, and that will be on Britain, Ireland, the Levant, and America.
And Richmore Crompton.
And Richard Crompton, of course. Yes, Joss William. Okay, so thanks very much for listening to this. We will see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to The Rest is History. For bonus episodes, early access, ad-free listening, and access to our chat community, please sign up at restishistorypod.com. That's restishistorypod.com.